So the first line of defense against pathogens that could actually potentially infect you, it involves your skin and your mucous membranes. Once a pathogen gets past that first line of defense, once it penetrates the skin or mucous membranes, then hopefully your second line of defense will stop the infection. And the second line of defense is mainly things that are in your blood. So cells, chemicals, and processes that originate in your blood. And so I have a few definitions. Blood is defined as plasma, which is the liquid portion of the blood, plus the formed elements, which are the cells. And then you have to define plasma. Plasma is defined as the serum plus the clotting factors. So you have clotting factors that help your blood to form clots. And the serum, if we want to define that, includes the water, electrolytes, gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen, proteins, antibodies, nutrients, hormones, drugs, everything else. So the main difference is you have the liquid of the blood that has things dissolved in it, and then you have the cellular component of the blood, which we call formed elements. Now, within the category of formed elements, we have three types of cells, and you need to know the common name and the scientific name, I guess you could say, or the more technical name for each. So red blood cells, also called erythrocytes, carry oxygen, and they're very uniform. They're shown here in this diagram. All right. So they look like little round cells. They're red. Platelets are also called thrombocytes. They're actually just fragments of cells, but they come from cells. They actually pinch off of cells in the bone marrow, and so they're included in the formed elements group. And then the leukocytes. The leukocytes are the white blood cells, and there's actually quite a few of different types of leukocytes. So we're going to focus on those. Your red blood cells don't do much in terms of preventing infection. They're carrying oxygen to your tissues. The platelets do help in forming clots or scabs if you have a break in your skin, for example, so they help to repair that first line of defense. And then you have these white blood cells which act to kill anything that gets beyond that first line of defense. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the leukocytes, or white blood cells. Now the leukocytes are grouped into two groups, the granulocytes and the agranulocytes. Of course, cytes means cells, so these are the cells that stain with, they look granular when they're stained, versus the cells that don't look granular when they're stained. So that's, somebody's opinion. That's how they're named. Whether or not you agree with that, it's kind of irrelevant. But that's how they're named. When you look at these pictures, what you're seeing mostly are these red blood cells. So the red blood cells are all these kind of pink cells that are in every picture. And then occasionally, your blood is by and large red blood cells in terms of the formed elements. And then occasionally you will see a cell. So you have the granulocytes and the agranulocytes. The most common white blood cell is going to be a neutrophil. 60 to 70% of the white blood cells are neutrophils. About 20 to 25% of the white blood cells are lymphocytes. So combined, that's mostly what you're going to see, neutrophils and lymphocytes. To a much smaller degree, you'll see basophils, eosinophils, and monocytes. We're going to talk briefly about each one, but in reality, most of your white blood cells are going to be neutrophils or lymphocytes. So for the granular leukocytes, like we said, they contain granules, and there are three types: the basophils, the eosinophils, and the neutrophils. Neutrophils and eosinophils act to phagocytize pathogens. So they are phagocytes. That means they do phagocytosis. And they can actually leave the blood vessels, particularly the capillaries. They can leave the circulatory system through a process called diapedesis. So put that vocabulary word in red here. That's leaving the blood vessel and going into the tissues. And then for your agranular leukocytes, we have lymphocytes and monocytes. And monocytes are also phagocytic. So you have several types of white blood cells that can do phagocytosis. Now, one thing that is helpful when you get a blood test done on a patient is the report will, when it comes back, will tell you the white blood cell count. So they'll count how many white blood cells of each type they see, and it can indicate, it can give you some information or some help in diagnosing disease. If you have an increased number of eosinophils compared to what's considered normal, then that can indicate either an allergic reaction or a parasitic worm infection. Leukocytes and neutrophils specifically are typically increased in bacterial infection, and a viral infection will show an increase in lymphocytes specifically. So a lot of times they can get that information from doing the blood test. Now, just to review, like we said, phagocytes are cells capable of phagocytosis, and so you have several types of white blood cells that can do phagocytosis. One of them is called the monocyte. When a monocyte leaves the blood vessel, it becomes what we call a macrophage. And a macrophage is a cell that does phagocytosis. So don't confuse the word macrophage with, like, remember bacteriophage, that's a virus that infects bacteria. Macrophage is a white blood cell that can move around your tissues and do phagocytosis on anything that it finds that shouldn't be there. So that would be any kind of pathogen, for example. So you have, like we said, you have several types of cells that can do phagocytosis. You also have cells that kill foreign cells, pathogens, but not by phagocytosis. So natural killer cells, neutrophils, and eosinophils secrete chemicals and toxins onto nearby cells that they have deemed to be foreign or invaders or pathogens. There are also some of the white blood cells will secrete something called interferon, which specifically prevents the spread of viral infection. And also there are some chemicals called complement, which are also released by white blood cells, and they actually work to break apart foreign cells. I can't recall why it's called complement. It seems like a terrible name, but it's a series of proteins that is secreted to destroy pathogens. And the way that complement destroys a pathogen is pretty complicated. It's a cascade of events, meaning the first complement protein activates another protein, which activates another protein, and so on and so forth, like dominoes falling. But ultimately what it does is it creates protein insertions into the membrane of a foreign cell, and it creates a hole in the foreign cell that we call the membrane attack complex. And anytime you make a hole in a cell, it's going to burst. It's going to pop like punching a hole in a balloon. And so complement is a series of proteins secreted by white blood cells that attack foreign cell membranes. Now, you typically will get what's called inflammation. That's a nonspecific response to some of the tissue damage that happens, not only as an effect of the pathogen, but also sometimes as an effect of the immune system attack on the pathogen. Sometimes you get some tissue damage, and that will trigger inflammation. Inflammation is when you have redness, heat, swelling, and pain in a localized area. There are two types of inflammation, and these are terms that we talked about before, acute and chronic. Acute inflammation is generally considered beneficial. In other words, you shouldn't always try to eliminate inflammation. You should not always, because if it's acute inflammation, then the inflammation is the process by which phagocytes are being brought into the area where there's some infection, cells that can do tissue repair, and so basically you don't want to always counteract an inflammation, because you would be basically counteracting the ability of your body to heal itself. However, if you have chronic inflammation, which is long-term inflammation, then you would want to try to minimize that, because chronic inflammation causes damage to tissues, and that can be much more significant. And so it's important for a physician or for a clinician to distinguish between acute inflammation and chronic inflammation. So this picture, if you look at it, it looks complicated, but at the top here you have the blood flow flowing through a capillary bed. So you probably remember that the blood vessels, as blood flows away from the heart, blood vessels become more and more branched and become more and more narrow until you have a bed of capillaries. Capillaries are the most leaky vessels, and that's where things can move in and out of the blood vessels and out of the circulatory system the easiest. And so a capillary bed normally has a certain amount of leakiness, but when you're having an inflammation, there will be a secretion of chemicals that causes the blood vessels to become dilated, and it increases the spaces. You can see on the bottom picture here, the spaces between the cells that make up the blood vessel become larger, and so more fluid and more cells are able to leave the blood vessel to access the infection or the damaged area. So on the left, you have a normal blood vessel, and things can leave a normal blood vessel if it's a capillary, but when there's inflammation, it's an increase in that movement of materials out of the blood vessels. Now on this figure, it's a little bit complicated, but I highlighted in green font and in red font some of the terms that you should pay attention to. So let's say you have a cut. You know, you're making dinner and the knife slips and you get a little cut. What you're seeing here in this first picture on the top left is the cut in the skin. And of course that penetrates the epidermis, and what you basically have is you're allowing bacteria, which we know we're covered in bacteria, to get past the first line of defense. But cells that have been damaged will release chemicals called prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and histamine. And that's normal. And that allows, like we said, that's what allows the blood vessels to become leaky and more permeable, and also attracts some of the white blood cells to the location. And so the prostaglandins and leukotrienes make the vessels more permeable, and the histamine causes the dilation. So they get wider to allow more blood flow. And both of those, all of that together improves the delivery of important cells to that site. So through diapedesis, some of the phagocytic cells will be able to come into the area and phagocytize the bacterial cells that have invaded. And then a blood clot will form. That's a whole nother process. Blood clotting is a complicated series of events that eventually seals the hole, seals the damage, and then that tissue can eventually be repaired. So you wouldn't want to immediately use an antihistamine, for example, because an antihistamine would bring down the swelling too soon. You want to let it swell some, as long as it's not getting out of control, and that's where you need a clinician to make that decision. But you want to allow a certain amount of inflammation to bring the correct phagocytes and other materials to that area for repair. So also part of the second line of defense is fever. Fever brings up the body temperature above 37, and it results when molecules called pyrogens trigger the hypothalamus to increase the body's core temperature. So a pyrogen includes bacterial toxins and other parts of bacteria, antigen, antibody complexes, and other chemicals released by phagocytes. So the fever will continue as long as the pyrogens are present. And just like the inflammation, some amount of fever is desirable if you have an acute situation, that this is allowing the interferons to be able to function better. It slows down the growth of the microbes themselves, or the reproduction of the microbes, and enhances the activities of some of your white blood cells. So you don't always want to counteract a fever too soon. Now, if you have a fever that's dangerously high, or if you're dealing with a child or an infant, then the rules are a little bit different. But in a healthy adult, a low-grade fever is actually part of the healing process, part of your body fighting off some kind of infection or some kind of pathogen. So this picture shows all the components of the first line of defense and the second line of defense. The first line of defense is skin and mucous membranes. The second line of defense includes the phagocytes and other white blood cells that secrete toxins and chemicals to kill microbes and invaders, plus the inflammation and fever processes which make that make those cells more able to stop the pathogens. But this is very nonspecific, and by nonspecific it means that it can work against all kinds of things, all kinds of different bacteria, all kinds of different viruses, all kinds. It would be the same things happening no matter what the pathogen is.